Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of STSM and COPAS, I want to welcome everyone to our second of 8 webinars on confidentiality and data access, entitled Privacy and Accuracy for 2020 Census Data Products, the CNSTAT Workshop. My name is Paul Schroeder, and I am the Executive Director of COPAS. Each of these webinars are repurposed from the STSM conference initially scheduled for April. Other sessions from the April program have been converted to a virtual STSM conference taking place on September 21st. If you have not registered yet, do not fret. Registration is reopening later this month. I want to remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded, and the video will be posted to the COPAS website within the next week. And now I'll turn it over to Daniel Cork from the Committee on National Statistics, who will serve as the chair of the session. Daniel?
Thank you, Paul. As Paul said, my name is Daniel Cork, and I was the study director for the activity that's the focus of today's webinar. So let me hold on for a second until I see my slides come up. And let's go ahead and go to the next one. Today's session is meant to give a flavor of the CNSTAT workshop on 2020 census data products held last December 11th and 12th in DC. The workshop was organized by an excellent 8-member planning committee chaired by Joe Hotz and Joe Salvo. The proceedings of the workshop is being written. It has been slow to appear only because the workshop was so successful in airing important issues. In particular, the workshop has resulted in an ongoing series of expert meetings to provide informal feedback to the Census Bureau as it continues to refine its methods. Next slide, please. As is well known by now, the Census Bureau determined that it needed to seriously overhaul its data disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census after simulating a database reconstruction attack against itself. Using only published tables from the 2010 census in combination with commercially available data, the Bureau was able to identify a level of possible disclosure risk that it found unacceptably high. A specific impetus for the workshop was the Census Bureau's agreement last summer to produce the 2010 demonstration data products, or DDP, that were created by running the confidential 2010 census data through the differential privacy-based disclosure avoidance system, or DAS, planned for the 2020 census. The result is a set of tables comparable to those published following the 2010 census. The Census Bureau had not yet obtained data user feedback in a systematic fashion, and for many data users, the DDP was the first chance to see and feel the impacts of the new DAS in their application areas, relative to the disclosure avoidance that was used in the 2010 tabulations. Accordingly, this was the main focus of the workshop, about 24 use cases across 7 broad categories of census data usage. We thank again all those speakers who turned around comparisons of the DDP and the original 2010 tables in a little over 1 month, as well as those experts who we asked to speak about more general implications of the new DAS in certain use areas. To get both data accuracy and privacy issues on the table, the workshop featured a dedicated panel discussion with 5 privacy experts. The Census Bureau outlined its own overview and analyses in 2 sessions at the beginning and the end of the workshop. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through the next slides very quickly just to add a very quick mention that the presentations and the video clips from the December workshop are available from the National Academy's website, shown here in the new look version. And next slide, please. With some Googling, they're also available in a little bit more integrated form, if a little bit older style look, on the Academy's legacy site. Next slide, please. But I want to spend a very quick couple minutes setting out a very basic description of how the 2020 DAS works, or at least how it did for the creation of the 2010 DDP. The actual differential privacy part of the process is straightforward. Its basic function is to inject statistical noise into every tabulated result in a controlled and structured way. So a share of the overall privacy loss budget, denoted by epsilon, is assigned to each of a set of histograms or queries, summary totals for some variable combinations across each of several geographic levels. These histograms must be capable of generating all of the intended published tables. Random draws from a probability distribution, symmetric around 0, and with a scale parameter determined by the relevant share of epsilon, are added to the histograms. These so-called noisy measurements are now privacy protected and have the desirable properties promised by differential privacy. Next slide, please. But the problem is that they don't look like what anyone expects from census data, and this is where post-processing and the Census Bureau's top-down algorithm come in. Working stepwise from the nation down to the census block, post-processing finds a best-fitting solution based on the noisy measurements in such a way that key values that should exactly match the confidential data, like state population, are held invariant, and other logical constraints are satisfied. The histogram values are non-negative integers, something basic that we expect from census tabulations. And the values are consistent, with the values for blocks summing to values at the block group level, block group to tract, and so on. The end result of this is a file that looks like census macrodata, but that is purely synthetic. It is wholly constructed based on the information in the privacy-protected noisy measurements, but it is capable of being put through the Census Bureau's tabulation routines to export census data products. Next slide, please. As I said, this processing proceeded down the levels of a nested hierarchy of geographic levels, fondly referred to at the workshop as the geographic spine. It consists of familiar census statistical units like tracts and blocks, and introduced a new concept of tract groups to make the stepwise computation easier. Next slide, please. But a recurring theme of the workshop presentations is that not all of the geographies of greatest policy or legal relevance are on the spine. So in the demonstration data products, entities like places, roughly cities and towns, and American Indian tribal areas must have their tables built by aggregating the block level data, which can have unexpected impacts relative to the 2010 tabulated results. Next slide, please. What all this means and how it works in practice is the reason for today's webinar. Today is going to be a reprise of 3 use cases from the workshop, presented by Nicholas Nagel from the University of Tennessee, Quentin Brummett from NORC at the University of Chicago, and Alexis Santos-Lozada from Penn State. Joe Hotz, co-chair of the workshop and from Duke, will give a synopsis of lessons learned and what we heard at the workshop. And Matt Spence from the Census Bureau will briefly recap what the Bureau presented in December and outline developments and improvements that have been made since then. We'd like to hold questions and discussion for the final block of time on the webinar. If people could use the chat function on the WebEx interface to submit questions, I will relay them to the speakers during the discussion period. So, having introduced everybody, I'm going to try to stay out of the way the rest of the way here, letting the baton pass from Nicholas to Quentin naturally and so on. And so with that, with no further ado, the floor belongs to Nicholas Nagel.
Thank you, Dan. While I'm waiting for the slides to come up, by way of introduction, the use case that I looked at was how would differential privacy, there we are, how would differential privacy impact the allocation of state revenues? States have written into their statutes many uses of census data and in which they allocate funds based on populations of places. And it was actually really hard to find many examples of these. There are many examples, but there's no database of them. So I spent a lot of time looking through state statutes looking for them. And so I'll share some of the what we've found. Next slide, please. One thing I'd like to start off with is we have, as part of our culture built into it, the assumption that we've always had a census and they've always been accurate, and we've never thought about inaccuracy in population counts, and we take these counts as if they're true and if they're correct, and we even put them on our signs like we have here. In the middle, there's a tiny town in Tennessee, Whitlock, with a population of 613. Certainly there's some inaccuracy in there, but we've always assumed that these things are true. Next slide, please. Here's just a few examples of state statutes that require census data. So here's a statute from the Tennessee Code. Tennessee is a state that depends heavily on sales taxes. We do not have income taxes. And so some of the sales taxes are redistributed back to communities based on their population. And so the distribution has to happen, quote, according to the latest federal census and other censuses authorized by law. And so that's a statutory requirement that what gets published by the census is used to distribute taxes. Here's another example from the Alaska Administrative Code. There they get a lot of money in oil revenue, and again, a lot of that is distributed based on various population counts. But the first count that they mention is a census of the United States Bureau of the Census. Next slide. One thing I want to point out here is states have never questioned whether or not census population counts are reliable for all populations, for all places. That's just been taken as given that the census is accurate. And with that assumption, they've written it into their code. Next slide. So here's an example of from Tennessee. Of what would have happened if we had distributed taxes in 2010 based on the differentially private data versus the real data. And it definitely creates winners and losers. So according to this particular allocation of funds, about a little bit less, about $120 per capita across the entire state is distributed to places. And if we assume that the 2010 data that were published are correct, some places, if we had allocated data based on the differentially private data, would have been real big winners, and some of the places would have been real big losers. And so while every place is supposed to get about $120 per person, the difference between the biggest and the smallest is anywhere from, there's one tiny community that would have received about $180 per person. And then on the other hand, there's another community that would have received about $80 per person. So there's more than, per capita, there was more than a 2 times difference between the biggest winners and the biggest losers if we had distributed funds based on the test product, the differentially private test product that was released at the end of last year. I'd like to point out that there is some bias and variance. I think we hear a lot from the census about trying to deal with the bias, but this is really an issue of variance, and the variance can be really big, especially for small places. Next slide, please. So here's what that distribution of change in revenue. So on the y-axis here, we have change in revenue. On the x-axis, we have the 2010 published population, the real population. And every dot here is a place in Tennessee. And you see that for the big places, there's not a large change in revenue, but for some per person, per capita. But for these small places, there can be a real big difference in change in revenue per capita. Places are small. I'd like to point that out. In Tennessee, most places are smaller than 5,000 people, and we see this big kind of explosion in variance for these small places on this chart. Next slide, please. Here's examples of what the effects look like for cities of various sizes. So I've got 8 cities here. They're from the 4 quartiles by place size in Tennessee. So we've got large cities over 100,000, and then we've got some really tiny incorporated places smaller than 1,000. And you can see that there, for the large places, there's not a big dollar difference in terms of change per capita. But when you get to these smaller places, there can be some real big differences. And these could matter for places, that are really struggling, have budgets of a few $1 million, really tiny places. This change could matter quite a bit for them. Next slide, please. Here's some other examples from outside Tennessee. So I've been calling this the census lottery. So here's the distribution of Indiana riverboat taxes, talking about lotteries. And here's another example from Indiana where revenues they receive from the riverboats are distributed to places based on census population counts. And you see there's some variances in terms of winners and losers again. Change the slide, please. It's another example. Many states have severance taxes for oil and gas and mineral extraction, and many of those funds are distributed back to the counties in which they came, but many states also distribute a portion of that across the entire state, across all the places in a state based on population. So here's an example of the histogram of winners and losers in West Virginia based on their allocation of severance taxes. Next slide, please. Here's another example I mentioned earlier from Alaska. They have what's called the Community Assistance Program, which again distributes, like a severance tax, distributes funds to the state. There's some really big losers. But the point I'd like to make here is that there's a lot of instances throughout state statutes across the nation of various ways in which census data are used to allocate funds. And these will all be impacted in various ways. I don't think we have a good idea yet of all the ways in which states use census data. I suspect we'll find out pretty quickly once communities are surprised by their count and see this impacting the bottom line. Next slide, please. This is a plot of every single incorporated place in the population, just to get an idea of the magnitude of error. And so there's a place here somewhere around a few hundred people, around 150 people, in which bigger places on average lose people. That's the red line, it's kind of the average. And then the small places on average gain people. The axis here is absolute error. On the next slide, I'll show you percent error. And so you can go to the next slide. Here, rather than looking at things in absolute terms, we're looking at things in relative terms. And you see there's this huge variability of winners and losers between small places. This isn't quite comparable to the previous class, with the previous graph. Here we have not places, but urban areas. It looks the same as places, but the point I want to make here is that we're also seeing that urban areas in general are also losing people. People are being shifted from large urban areas to small urban areas, and from large urban areas, and from all urban areas to rural places. So on the net, it looks like the urban population of 2010 declines when we use the differentially private data. Next slide, please. Another example, curious how it impacts education funding, because that's a commonly asked question. And it won't have a huge impact as far as we can tell on education funding, because most education funding is not tied to the census. Most education funding is tied to enrollment records, but census data are often used to forecast future enrollments in public schools. And so here's an example of what the population by age looks like for those under 18. This is just a scattering of school districts around where I live in East Tennessee. The black line is the truth that was published in 2010, and the red line are the differentially private data. And if you think about trends, it looks like the trends of the red lines and the trends of the black lines are the same. But if you were to look at individual age brackets and try to figure out what's going to be the incoming cohort of students in 2 years, there can be some big differences between the red lines and the black lines. And it's not clear that local school district authorities would have the tools or the capabilities to perhaps smooth the red curve to come up with the trends. Because that's really what's going to have to happen, is there's a lot of noise in the red curve. They're not usable by themselves. They need to be smoothed in some way. It definitely appears that if you were to, by eyeball, smooth the red line, it would look like the black line. But that's something that, that's an extra set of tools that a lot of people aren't capable or aren't familiar with. And it's going to be required under this new regime of private data. Next slide. To wrap up here, one thing I'd like to point out is that jurisdictions matter, and that there are lots of legal instances that require use of population data. And the jurisdictions that matter most, perhaps, are states, counties, and minor civil divisions in the states that have MCDs, incorporated places, and tribal areas. Now, that's one list of jurisdictions that matter. If we look at the census and how privacy is allocated, Dan mentioned this. Census privacy is controlled by state, counties, tracts, block groups, and blocks. A lot of those jurisdictions are not on this spine that Dan mentioned, and that could create problems for our statutes. Am I out of time? Did I hear something, Dan? No, I'm close to finish.
You've got about 1 minute.
Excellent. After we presented these results in November, at least I heard that an acknowledgement from the census that the data that were published and that I analyzed are not fit for use for incorporated places in American Indian areas. And that acknowledgement is encouraging. And we've seen a lot of work in the news and elsewhere about how Census is rapidly working on solutions. But one point I'd like to make is we are rapidly running out of time to get stakeholder review. All these jurisdictions that depend on census data, it's not clear that they're going to, how much input they're going to have into whether or not the new data are adequate for use. And that's a big question. Will the data be adequate for use for all the jurisdictions that matter? Next slide. And that's what I have. So thank you very much. And there's my contact info if you want to reach out to me for more questions. Thank you.
And should I just go ahead?
Yep, as soon as your slides are up, Quentin.
Awesome.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone for having me out. So I'm going to talk about a bit different use case, and that I'm going to talk about survey operations. And so at NORC, we run a lot of different surveys, and there are a lot of pieces of these operations that rely on census data. And so what I'm going to talk about is some kind of simulations we've done, looking at what effect we think the additional differentially private noise might have on those operations. So next slide. So I won't belabor the motivation too much, but obviously there were some very good reasons for modernizing disclosure avoidance at the Census Bureau. But such a large disclosure avoidance system has a lot of different decisions that go into it. And so, understanding how to make those decisions, what epsilon to choose, all these things really depends on both privacy concerns as well as the different use cases that Census has. And so hopefully, what we talked about in December is helpful to Census in informing all these small decisions along the way. Next slide. So what I'm really going to talk about today is one piece of all survey operations, which is sample design. So that's where I'll spend most of my time. But before kind of diving in, I just note, I think there are a lot of different places along the way where census data gets used. So in terms of sample design, frame building, listing of samples, oversampling, a lot of that breaks down to just how accurately we can predict a household characteristic. That's really what I'm most interested in. But in terms of collecting the survey, there are fielding cases where We might want to figure out how to prioritize cases using block or block group level data, potentially using vacancy or household composition data. I think at least given the 2010 demonstration data we saw, this could have some pretty significant effects on it. It could be very hard to do some of this, but the impact is a bit hard to quantify because these are more ad hoc decisions and not as necessarily a systematic thing as some of the sampling design things I'll talk about. After data collection, there's a lot of weighting and imputation. We'll also use this. This is particularly true for aggregated high levels of geography. And these are much less effective at DP. So, state level population counts are always exact, but like state level fraction African American versus fraction white, things like that are going to be really pretty close to accurate. So I foresee very few changes due to the differential privacy. And I'll include the caveat, and I think others will talk about this at the end, that the census DAS is currently undergoing some significant changes. So all these results are from the demonstration data back in December. Next slide. So to show you what I mean by just how accurately we can predict a household, this is a scatter plot of racial composition in a census tract, in the 2010 census data that was released, and in the differentially private demonstration data. And so on the left, we have the percent of the tract that's white, and on the right, we have the percent of the tract that's African American. And we can see there's a red line there on the screen, and you can see the vast majority of the tracts are clustered around this red line, which is the 45-degree line, indicating that the data is pretty accurate. And there are some that are quite far off. And so, in the context of surveys, things we might be particularly worried about are dots that are on the bottom, which are places where the actual or the released 2010 census data says that there are, for instance, African Americans living in the census tract, but the differentially private data would have none. And then if we were running a survey, we might not go there. That might lead to a coverage lapse in the survey. So next slide. But I will note this slide just takes that previous tract level slide and aggregates it into 1,000 cells of data so that we have about 70 tracts for each of these little dots. And you can see now it's lining up right along that 45-degree line. So this kind of aligns with what Nicholas was saying in terms of bias. There, you can see there are some dots that fall off, but in general, the bias issues aren't as first order as the variance issues. Next slide. So to kind of dig into what effects the additional DP noise might have on survey operations, we're going to run through a kind of constructed example where we look at a survey operation using the DP data and census data. And so thanks to the Minnesota Population Center, as well as the Cornell Institute for Social and Economic Research for making some of the DP data accessible. When I say 2010 census data, what I'm referring to is the released SF1 files from 2010. Next slide. All right, so I won't belabor the specifics of exactly how this hypothetical survey we're going to run works, but the idea is that we're going to construct a hypothetical sampling frame using the available data. We're going to oversample for a specific subpopulation, so we'll look at major racial and ethnic subgroups. And the point here is that we're going to sample everywhere, but because we want more precise estimates for a particular subgroup, we're going to sample more heavily in areas with higher concentrations of that subgroup. And that helps us gain more efficient estimates and cut costs. Next slide. And so I'll look at two different outcomes of this. The first, and I alluded to this earlier, is going to be most important, is coverage. And so our sampling frame is only going to include census tracts with greater than 0 population for a given subgroup. And so we're going to be looking at what fraction of the population will we just miss in the sampling frame, or what, flipping on its head, coverage is going to say what fraction is included in our sampling frame. And then the second is efficiency. And here we're going to project the increase in survey costs and just give a rough percentage of what we think the additional increase in survey costs might be, because we're no longer able to control as accurately where we want to sample in order to obtain a specific sample size. Next slide. So this slide shows the projected coverage for a survey that oversamples. There are 4 different surveys here that would oversample 4 different major racial and ethnic subgroups. And you can see across the board, the coverage is very close to 100%. So I think, for African American oversampling or Hispanic oversampling, Asian oversampling, we're seeing basically no effect. For the AIAN subgroup, we do see that there's a little bit of a lack of coverage. We're at 96%. If I were to editorialize one, I think this would be a concern. It would be additional error in the survey, but it wouldn't be so grave a concern that you wouldn't do the survey or wouldn't be able to learn anything about this. Next slide. If we look at survey costs, you can see things are pretty small. So they got rounded a little bit here. There are actually some decimals in there, but the projected increase in survey costs are very small. And in fact, I'm going to show you a few other slides with smaller and smaller subgroups. The costs aren't really going to change. The costs are going to be more or less the same. So I'm not too worried about cost increases, at least in this specific context. Next slide. So going back to coverage, now I'm going to start just kind of cutting the data a bit smaller to show you, if I'm interested in a more and more focused subgroup, the error can start having more and more of an effect. So here, instead of just a survey for everyone, we're looking at a survey of 25 to 49-year-old males, and then splitting it across the same racial and ethnic subgroups. And here you can see, again, African American and Hispanic subgroups, we're getting still pretty good coverage. Asian now, we're around that 95% level, which I think is, in my opinion, is error to be concerned about, but nothing incredibly grave. But 75% coverage now for the AIN subpopulation, that's, I think, getting to the range where you would start really worrying about what your sampling frame was actually having. Next slide. So if I restrict now just to 25 to 49-year-old males in California, you can see that, for African Americans, we're only getting about 95% coverage, so we're losing a little bit of coverage, but still Hispanics and Asians are pretty good. And then next slide, just to kind of show you that this really can fall apart. If I was to go to a survey of 25 to 49-year-old males in West Virginia, then kind of across the board, we're starting to see kind of significantly lower coverage rates. And this is a bit of a constructed example. This isn't intended to be, the ultimate survey, but it's more intended to represent it as you start slicing the data, eventually the coverage falls apart because you need to find, because you can no longer trust that if it says there's 0 of a relatively rare population, that actually means there are 0 people living. Next slide. So, like I said, the disclosure avoidance system has been continually improving. I think issues such as vacancy rates are probably much more likely to be improved, although I'll let Matt talk mostly about it. The one thing I did want to point out, related to this is that, the choice of where to spend the privacy budget is always going to involve some trade-offs, and so I think I'm interested to see a lot of the improvements that have been made, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be a little bit of a scale where you have to decide where you're going to put more of the noise and where you're going to put less. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap up mostly what I covered, I think the effects of DP noise on survey costs are projected to be minimal. And something like oversampling of African American or Hispanic households in a nationally representative survey, I think, is going to be functionally unaltered. In the context of smaller demographic groups, especially as we get to, within certain states, within certain age groups, it can result in coverage issues. And finally, I'll just note that, because weighting relies on accurate population benchmarks, some of this error can kind of propagate through different products as different products use DP noise, and it continues to get recycled. Next slide. So in terms of the survey use case specifically, Here we're studying on-spine geographies, which are very important for the demonstration product, especially tracks. And so that is something definitely working in favor of DP having a smaller impact. And we're studying noise that's across a number of different geographic areas. So, going back to Nicholas's talk, a lot of the funny application examples are we really want very precise data for every location so that they aren't getting more or less funding. In the survey example, we're looking across a number of different areas, and so we have a lot more leeway, especially if there are smaller areas where we can have error and it kind of averages out across our entire survey. And I'll end with just two minor caveats. One is that the American Community Survey is currently used for a lot of different survey purposes, and a potential future differentially private version of that could have significantly more effects than the 2020 census. And it's still a little unclear how users might account for the error induced by DP. And so I think to the extent that measures of error introduced by DP are available, and this is something we're actively working on, is trying to figure out how we can take account of that as a sophisticated user, especially in something like the survey operation, to account for that in all of our analyses. So next slide. Thank you very much, and there's my contact information. I look forward to any questions or discussion.
My turn? Right.
Your turn, Alexis.
Yes. Well, thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here. And I will talk about this. This is the initial results I presented in the National Academies Conference. What I would say is that there's a paper already out. It's called How Will Differential Privacy Affect Our Understanding of Health Disparities in the United States? It's in the proceeding of the National Academy of Science. Feel free to access it or just send me an email, I'll send it over. I know this is shameless self-promotion, but I want you to read it, and it's clearly stated there with restricted depth data. Right, next slide. So this is just a very basic introduction to what DP does. What I'll do is I'll just skip this and go straight to the results. So next slide. Next slide again. Next one. Yes, so essentially what happens with all the things that we've discovered with the demonstration product is that we have a change in the denominators that are crucial for us to understand incidence, prevalence, and even mortality rates across the United States. Many analyses that employ multi-level analysis use county-level rates to control for environmental exposure or simply for multi-level controls. And one thing we saw is that for the total population, we are able to see shift in the total population. And I wondered whether or not these shifts are going to impact our understanding of health disparities in mortality moving forward. So what would we would have concluded in terms of mortality rates in 2010 if this data set was published. Next slide. And what we found is that the changes in the population at the county level, at least the ones that we're using, are substantially higher for minorities in terms of percentages. This is just raw counts, but our reanalysis shows that the raw impact in terms of percentages is higher for racial ethnic minorities. Next slide. And here you have it. So, for example, the range of these changes is quite bigger for the non-Hispanic Black population and Hispanics in the United States. Look at those, county changes percentages between the original releases of the data that employ swapping and current methods and the proposed the disclosure avoidance one, DP, differential privacy. And what we found is that, and you'll see it later on, and what are the implications of this, and we found that the small areas were substantially impacted by this analysis. You can remember, if any of you have been following this, you can remember that paper, that article published in the New York Times saying that small towns were going to disappear under this new data release, and this is seen also for smaller counties in the United States. Next slide. So essentially, what we wanted to do is compare mortality rates calculated using both sets of denominators just to measure impact. Next slide. And what we saw, and if you look at the updated figures in the differential privacy paper, it's quite consistent. It's for the overall population and non-Hispanic whites, we have acceptable metrics, very similar metrics in terms of mortality rates. Once we employ the 2010 US denominator and the differential privacy denominator, but for non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics, the change is bigger. There's more noise introduced to this denominators. We have this blue line of equality where things would fall if both denominators were the same. Again, the deaths don't change. What changes the denominators. So we see more spread in terms of the mortality rates calculated for minority populations. And this could also be done for other racial ethnic groups, and we have done it, and we see that there's much more noise observed for minority groups than for non-Hispanic whites and the overall population, which the overall population is sort of like an average out of the noise moving forward. Next slide. And so to compare mortality rates, what we do is we do the mortality rate ratio. And so essentially you have the numerator being the mortality rate for 2010 and the denominator being the mortality rate for 2010 with a demonstration product. And this will give us a measure of sort of magnitude of difference between both mortality rates. Let's go forward. And so we see for non-Hispanic whites and the overall population that it averages out to 100. Well, it also happens for minority groups, but what we observe also is that we have lower minimums for non-Hispanic blacks, about a 40% difference from the mortality rate calculated with one vintage of the data in comparison to the other in some cases. This is the minimum. And in terms of the Hispanic population, we have a minimum of about a 10% difference. And also, if we look at the maximum also is higher for the Hispanic population, meaning that, yes, this disclosure avoidance system as initially proposed is going to impact our understanding of health disparities, and I'm exemplifying this through the use of denominators for mortality, but one can think of, for example, assessments of opioid epidemics within small areas, and whether or not we want to understand the opioid epidemic with more detail in terms of racial ethnic breakdowns. Subsequent research that I've done has looked at age-specific mortality rates, and the results are quite consistent with what I'm going to show you now. Next slide. So this is just the plot of the changes in this is the plot of the mortality rate ratio. So remember 100, most of them are clusters toward 100. This means that on average, the method is, it's doing well. But if we look at the extremes, we have differences in extremes for non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics, about a 20%, 25% difference in mortality rates. There's that case I mentioned with about a 30% mortality difference. This is not observed for non-Hispanic whites. Again, this is sort of showing us that down the road, these changes in denominators are going to have implications on how we are going to understand racial ethnic disparities in health in the United States. And there's a preprint up, is how will differential privacy affect our understanding of population growth in the United States? And it's available for anybody who wants to access it. It's in Social Archive. And this shows us simply how we will understate or overstate population growth in the United States based on the changes in the vintages of the data. And this will have implications for us understanding population growth and decline of minorities in the United States by metro, non-metro areas moving forward. And that's available free of charge. You can look at it or just send me an email, send it over. Next slide. Next slide. So, and this is the interesting figure that keeps coming up when I do this sort of analysis is how is this change in mortality rates associated with population size? And believe it or not, for minorities, what we observe is that in smaller areas we have a higher percent change in terms of the estimates of mortality rates, and that's for non-Hispanic Blacks and Hispanics is true for them. Something that we don't observe, or we do observe it, but not to the same degree and magnitude for non-Hispanic whites, which are shown in panel B. And again, this goes back into the issue of what areas are we going to study? How will this differently impact areas with small populations and areas in which 100 persons are crucial to a specific calculation, right? It's not the same saying that I'm going to calculate this for a small county in Texas, say, for example, Loving County, that always comes up in our analysis, has 100 population, right? Versus Bexar County in Texas, that is where San Antonio is, which is a substantially higher population, or Harris County, which is where Houston is. Next slide, please. And here is something that sort of goes into the issue of population size, and this is the mortality rate ratios by the rural-urban continuum codes, particularly because we know that the emergence of mortality pockets and disparities in the non-metropolitan mortality penalty and other lines of research may be impacted by this analysis. So, and even just topics like the opioid epidemic, where we're seeing clusters in rural areas. So if we don't have good denominators, we may be overstating or understating the risk in specific areas. And what we observe here is that for minority groups, again, on average, for the overall population, non-Hispanic whites, it behaves within acceptable margins, is what I have been calling it. But when you go into more specific non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic analysis, you do see significant, I mean, I'm not doing a t-test here, but you do see sizable differences in the mortality rate estimates for 2010, depending on which data set we're using. And it's substantially lower for metropolitan areas. But as you move upper into the more rural you get, which is, from 4 to 9, 9 being the most rural, you end up having higher levels of error in terms of the estimates of mortality rate for the United States, for minority populations specifically. Next slide. And curiously, I did not find any spatial patterns, but what I'm showing here is simply whether or not the mortality rate is above or below what we've calculated. And as you can see, there's I will say, a healthy mix of overestimation and underestimation of mortality rates. And what this is saying is that maybe I didn't find any patterns in this is what I would say in terms of spatial for the overall population. Next slide. If we do it by level of accuracy, the blue represents that being within a 0.25% of what was estimated using the data, the 2010 data. So essentially what we're finding here is that we have pockets of areas in which there's overestimations above those levels. If you look at the first paper mentioned in the presentation, you'll find that once you expand that range of acceptability, there's areas in which the mortality rate estimation is off by more than 1.5% even. Next slide. This is for non-Hispanic whites. Again, healthy mix of below and overestimation. Next slide. And again, like you can see that there's more blue here. And blue matters because blue is what we would consider acceptable within a very tight, 0.25% points within the analysis. Next slide. So for non-Hispanic blacks, one of the issues is that we don't have that data for a lot of counties in the United States. If you look at the paper, there's more counties that do have information on this. We went through the process with CDC to access the restricted file, and we're able to get a couple of counties in. But the results show, a combination of these. If we look at the next slide,
1 minute or so if you want to jump to conclusions.
Yes, sir. You'll see that there's substantially less blue than in the previous map. Next slide. So 2 more. Yes, and again, this is for Hispanics. We do see some levels of blue, but we do see more presence of red and green, and this is well explained and laid out in the article we presented. But again, the conclusion is we are finding that as proposed, this will change and impact our understanding of health disparities in the United States by using a case study of mortality. Next slide. I think I'm almost done. No, I won't present this. Let's go forward. Next one. And so it will have the variation in our denominators. There will be variation introduced by noisy denominators that we use to construct our mortality rates, with the effects being larger for small areas and racial ethnic minorities. And a regression analysis I did presents socioeconomic characteristics associated with increased level of mortality rates, with the noise. And that analysis is available. If anybody wants to see it, you can just send me an email. Next, I think it's the thank you slide. Oh, reduce our understanding, reduce of understanding health disparities where we're not doing so well. That it has the potential of doing that. And again, I think what was mentioned before, we're kind of running out of time to assess new products. So I'm really concerned about what will happen down the road. I think the next one is the thank you slide. But anyway, thank you for your attention. I look forward to questions and discussion. Thanks. Thanks, Daniel.
And next up will be Joe Hawes. Yep.
Thank you, Dan. So what I'm going to talk about is some of which has already been covered, but by Dan and others concerning this workshop. And I'm going to summarize some of the findings. We'll be talking about some general points that come out that are reflected in the talks that you've heard here. There were other talks that were provided in different user case areas or use case areas, and I'll summarize that. And then I want to talk a little bit about the ongoing effort that involves CNSTAT. Next slide, please. So this slide tells you a lot about it's really a repeat of most of the points that have been made by both Dan Cork's presentation and others. Per se, I don't want to spend any time on it other than to sort of note the progression here of what's happened. The issue is about privacy and individual privacy. That's coupled with, as Dan noted, the fact that that challenges have become greater to protect the privacy and confidentiality of information provided to any from any sources of data, but in particular the Census Bureau, which is covered by Title 13, which has they interpreted a requirement to protect the confidentiality of the data. And the fact that they went through this so-called re-identification exercise determined that the old disclosure avoidance system, largely based on swapping, and I'll have something more to say about that in a few minutes, resulted in a decision to make to move to a new disclosure avoidance system, DAS, based on differential privacy. Next slide. Again, Dan has covered some of this. This is sort of the framing of the workshop. What happened, as is indicated here, and as Dan has talked about, this so-called demonstration data product was produced based using the 2010 census data, but applying the new DOS methodology based in part on differential privacy, and that part is going to, Dan has already covered, also included something called post-processing, which I'm going to talk about. And the CNSAT was commissioned to run, to organize and conduct a workshop of users who would compare, for their particular use cases, the data, the original census data that was under the old DAS system versus that the demo data using the new DAS system. Joe Salvo and I were that chaired this workshop, as Dan indicated, workshop planning committee. We had a great group of presentations. It was a lively 2-day workshop, very well attended. And you just heard three of the presentations. I missed Quentin on this. My apologies, Quentin, on this list. And Matt Spence is going to talk about, was another presenter. So in total here on this webinar, we've had 4 of the presentations. There were more. It turns out that since the arrangement, and this is, those of you who are familiar with the National Academy's operation, they're very careful about what conclusions can be drawn and what types of, in particular, recommendations, et cetera, can be done in some types of studies, so-called consensus studies that the National Academy does. This was not one of those studies. So as Dan indicated, he's still working on the proceedings, that is just an accounting of what happened. Joe Salvo and I, as individuals, we happened to be attending this workshop, took it upon ourselves to write a summary, or what we've referred to as a document that's called What We Heard. The 2 links there that are in orange, light orange, I guess, if you download the slides, right, take you to a version of this various places. Our summaries are What We Heard document is can be found at various websites. This one, if you get to the slides, is at the American Statistical Association. Next slide. Okay, I want to spend a minute talking about, because this is an important part of the story, about the process, or the so-called data production pipeline. This borrows a slide from my collaborator, Joe Salvo, and co-chair on this. And the point here really is to sort of note something that's about the process of how data is constructed. If you move from left to right, the red show data is collected from, which is in the, which we're collecting now for the 2020 census. Files are come in, and there's work done that edit those files, creating the so-called CEFs, census edited files. And then there's this step in the middle, in purple here, which is the disclosure avoidance strategy that's being used. And this is illustrating the new disclosure avoidance system, which, as Dan indicated, really consists of 2 parts. One part is the use of differential privacy, the infusion of noise into tabulations done from the CEF data, and altering those in a controlled way. And one of the mantras and claims to this differential privacy strategy is we can tell you exactly how that process went, exactly the nature of the draws, which is different from previous disclosure methods such as swapping, where census can't tell. In fact, we've talked to different people who work at Census Bureau fairly high up who actually don't know exactly what the process was for swapping, because if it was revealed, then in principle you can undo that process and identify people. So that's one of the claims to fame. You inject noise, but then there's a second piece, which is in part always have to do. You can get things like negative counts, right? You can infuse noise in an area for a population that has very few people, or very few people of a particular demographic characteristic, right? And it's entirely possible that the draw that you realize from the distribution, even a the specified distribution, that is a small variance distribution, could be negative, and so suddenly you're stuck with negative counts. And so there's always this issue about sort of cleaning that up. In addition, there are other, as Dan somewhat indicated, right, there are also these things about, you got to have these numbers kind of add up. You want, for example, at the state level, you want the counts to be actually the counts you found in the data. You don't want those to in any way perturbed. Those are so-called invariants. There are structural zeros. You don't want a young kid, a 3-year-old is the head of household, so you got to sort of protect against those issues. So post-processing is always going to be there in terms of cleaning up the table. There's another feature here, though, that I'm going to wait to talk about later, that takes you through what's called the creation of privacy-protected microdata files. This used to be called MDFs, and then this is the new terminology of PPMFs. And that microdata file is actually what's used to produce the data files that are ultimately distributed. Dispensed here were the PL 94171 files, which those are familiar with all these terminologies, recognized as the redistricting files that are sent to the states for purposes of state legislatures being redistricted, city governments being county governments being redistricted, if there are school board districts, et cetera, right? As well as demographic and household characteristic files, which are the lifeblood of a lot of demographic analysis. And also there's potential for special tabulations. Okay, if you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now I want to go through a series of slides which tell you what we learned or what we heard in this workshop. Some of this has already been covered in the particular presentations for the use cases that Nick, Quentin, and Alexis sort of has already presented, and to some extent will be covered by Matt in his presentation. But I want to draw some general points. Some of them are pretty obvious and not surprising. Some of them are a little bit more surprising. So the first point is that at some level, at high levels of geography, and for what amounts to certain demographic groups, and this was shown in various graphs in various ways that were in the presentations and were shown in many of the other presentations. Is that I'm trying to speak across a range of different presentations. There are very similar results between the, if you will, the old and the new DAS systems operating on the same raw data, right, the 2010 data. This is especially true at higher levels of geography. So, nations look pretty good in terms of its demographic composition between the two data. There's not much difference, states, large metropolitan areas. But it also turns out that if you use at least broad age categories, one thing that many uses of demographic data from the census is understanding the age distribution. Nicholas already talked about a point of using this for school enrollment. You're trying to forecast how many, from the population, how many 5-year-olds are going to show up next year in your school district to possibly attend public schools. So what was found is that by and large, the age distributions, if you use broad enough categories, which is a problem for the school enrollment case, right, were pretty similar between the two groups. And third, right, these were pretty accurate for large demographic groups, particular non-Hispanic whites, which are a sizable part of the population in most areas, and in some cases, sometimes in some cases, Hispanics, although that varied into geography. Okay, but, and now the big but, there were real concerns about the data, the differences between the old and new DAS system, the data that the two systems produced for small geographic areas, so-called off-spine geography, and certain population groups. Okay, so much of the evidence suggested from the workshop that if you went down to the block level, which for some uses are really important, from all the applications that were talked about up till now, some of those will require that block use data. Certainly, this data is of importance at the block level, knowing characteristics for the purposes of redistricting. That data, probably a little strong, but it's a word we use in the summary, right, was just not usable. It was noisy, and I'm going to talk about it was also subject to systematic bias. And this was not, if you go up the geography to more aggregated units, this even occurred in some block groups and track levels, especially for certain groups. The second issue that is noted here is the matter of what we, again, it's already been sort of set up, off-spine geography, right? These are places. If you go to the next slide for just a second, I'll show you what I mean. This is a diagram of the geographic hierarchy that Census refers to, and if you turn it down the middle of this diagram is the kind of the geography, the hierarchy of that geography that's typically known from the nation down to census blocks at the very bottom, and in between are states, counties, census tracts, et cetera. But to your left or right, you'll see there are other geographic units, right, that are not necessarily on that spine. These are the so-called off spine. They're potentially quite important ones. School districts, right, are not necessarily sort of made up of easily put on. They don't fit on the spine. Places, the small areas that are that kind of over in this southeast quadrant of this diagram are another sort of geographic units that are off spine. Okay. In addition to this, right, there is the whole matter of if you could go back a slide. Sorry, I'm gonna. Thank you. It's also the case going down to the bottom, right, that there were problems with these off-spine categories. Well, why was that true? Well, in large part because the design of the 2010 demonstration data is all based on, or is based in good part on the distribution of the epsilon, the so-called privacy loss budget, the loss of privacy, and the attempt through the differential privacy methodology to control that by quantifying how much you're willing to give up in privacy. And you have a whole budget that's allocated. I don't have time to go into sort of all the details of that process, but the point really here is that these are cases in which the privacy budget in design of the 2010 demonstration products just didn't give any privacy budget to the places. So, and the noise, right, was not essentially in the control of the noise infusion was made. There was no attempt to allocate and take into account in the allocation of this privacy loss budget, and thus the controlling of the noise that was infused into the data in the first part of the DAS process simply didn't take into account places. So in one sense, it's not surprising that there were problems there, but it's sort of disturbing. The same token, right, there wasn't sort of attention done to especially localities, reservations, but otherwise of American Indian and Native Alaskan counts. And those too were found to sort of be problematic in terms of their impact. If you would skip the next slide and go one more. Okay.
About 90 seconds if you could wrap up.
Sure. Alexis has already referred to this, right? There was a temporal consistency problem of population counts. I look at this in a slightly different way. It had to do with sort of the issue of calculating disease and mortality rates, and I won't say anything more about it. But the last point on this slide was the fact that with post-process, most of the issues of the problems that were observed came up with post-processing, the post-processing component of the new DAS system. In particular, dealing with these negative counts. It turns out that these negative counts have to be corrected and they have to sort of be adjusted. And there are procedures that were used in the original DAS that did that. I won't go into the detail about that, but what turned out to be true is while there is noise, and we understood that there was going to be noise associated, right, variability as has been referenced, the dealing with these negative counts through this post-processing project induced systematic bias in the counts. We saw that across a number of use cases in the presentations at the workshop. I talk a little bit about what it is. And I also noted the very last bullet point here, this bias, while at the workshop was in some sense unexpected, actually in further thought, actually is not so surprising. There's a mathematical set of reasons as to why that happens in these algorithms. Go to the next slide. And in part, they have to do with the last slide here. I got one more slide after this that I really need to go through, but have to do with the fact, whoops, sorry, yeah, leave it there. Have to do with the fact that the system that the Census Bureau is using is to produce microdata files as the output of this data, and that puts greater pressure on and strain on and greater demands on this post-processing stage. Again, if we have time in discussion, I can say more about that. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. It's an important point, but I won't go there. Okay, so what's happened now? Well, because of the things and the findings that came out of this workshop, Census and Matt is going to discuss this, develop the plan for trying to address these in improvements to the DAS system. But in a part of that, right, Census requested continuing involvement of CNSTAT on this work, and in particular to organize a group of experts from users and other user groups to help advise them. And Joe Salvo and I are chairing this effort as well. I list there the groups which represent areas in which there's clearly a need for work in terms of trying to shape the improvement. I've kind of touched on each of those. There's a whole part which, again, Matt's going to talk about with respect to item number 4 about metrics. One of the outgrowths of this, and I'll stop with this, right, is that of this effort, the CNSTAT effort, and this comes out of this group of experts, is along the way, Census is going to be producing additional data from what they call sprints, and I'll leave that to Matt to sort of explain, which are updates of these attempts to improve the DOS system and looking at its output. One of the things that happened as a result of this, and the credit here goes to those of you who know him, David Van Riper and IPUMS, are producing new versions of the table so that the data can be directly compared with the demo data that was used in the December 2019 workshop to provide users and available to the user community to do their own comparisons to essentially, in addition to the metrics that Matt will talk about, to provide an opportunity for the user community to assess whether Census is getting things better or worse for their particular use cases. Thank you.
And batting cleanup is Matt Spence. Who may be muted.
I'm sorry about that.
There we go.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Oh boy. So hello everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Spence. I am in the Population Division of the U.S. Census Bureau. Today I'm going to talk about what we found and what we discussed in the December CNSTAT meetings from the 2010 demonstration product file, as well as some of the subsequent improvements that we've seen since then, some subsequent developments. So next slide, please. So as you all know, the 2020 Disclosure Avoidance System, or DAS, which is also sometimes called the top-down algorithm, was developed because our research had shown that there was a danger of potential re-identification from tabulated data in the 2010 census. So the privacy protection needed to be strengthened for the 2020 census. In October of 2019, the Census Bureau released the 2010 Census Demonstration Data Product that took 2010 data as reported, the CEF, as you might know, and ran it through a preliminary version of the 2020 DAS. And then we generated tabulated values for all of our PL 94-171, which are redistricting tables, as well as the, what used to be called the SF1 tables, and now will be called the DHC tables, so demographic and housing characteristics tables. So this was a set of a lot of tabulations that that you could look at and see how they compared to the published results. Users gave us a lot of great feedback at the CNSTAT meeting. I'm going to talk to you about what we found as well. So next slide, please. So we presented several findings of our own analysis of the work on the 2020 DAS. We found that the more populous geographic areas were less noisy in terms of comparing the 2010 demonstration product tabulations to the original tabulations. So throughout, comparing the privacy protect tabulated values to the original tabulated values. So we found that more populous geographic areas were less noisy. Los Angeles County was very close in either data set, but less populous areas were more noisy. Blocks in particular were very noisy. So if you look at all 11 million or so blocks and you take the difference between the privacy protected tabulation and the original tabulated value. And so you get 11 million differences, and you take that median absolute value of that difference as a percent of the block population, you end up getting 6% difference. So that, on average, the average block changes its population 6%. Now, a lot of those blocks are not, occupied. They're zero population blocks. So if you only look at blocks with non-zero population, so the occupied blocks, the median absolute percent difference between the two files was 36%. So obviously that's a very big change in the population there. For block groups, it was smaller at 1.2%, tract 0.5%, and counties was 0.2%. So you'd think, okay, 0.2%, that's pretty close. But we did find, as I mentioned, more populous geographic areas were less noisy. So if you looked at the counties with total population of less than 7,500 people, which is a fair number of counties, their average absolute percent difference was 1.4%. So, much bigger than the 0.2% that the rest of the counties saw. And as mentioned previously, we found that areas that were not part of the so-called geographic spine or the geographic hierarchy had larger errors as well. So one of those kinds of geographies are the incorporated places, and those had a 3.2% median absolute percent difference. We also heard from a lot of data users that, as an example, American Indian Alaska Native lands were also subject to this increased error, even controlling for population size. The similarly sized place or AIAN area would have more noise, have greater error than a similarly sized county. Okay, next slide, please. We also found that beyond total population, the characteristics data were also noisier for smaller groups. So here we're looking nationwide, and the leftmost column is the 2010 census as tabulated. The next column to the right is the 2010 demonstration product, and the rows show the total. So as you see, the total is the same because it's the same number of people. That's held invariant. And then we have the population of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 races. And so you can see that the population of one race had a pretty small change. It would end up being a 0% change. And even the population of 2 races had a small change, 0.3%. But the population of 4, 5, and 6 races had much larger changes as a percent of their overall numbers. In particular, the number of people with 6 races went from 792 people up to 3,200 people. So that's a fairly large change at a national scale. You would imagine that at the nationwide scale, it would be smaller. So at the next slide, please. Moreover, we found that, as mentioned before, due to the requirement that we cannot have negative counts, we found that the smaller populations tended to see an increase in size, whereas the larger populations saw a decrease. So here, I take the counties and I break them up by the size of the county and put them in groups. So all the counties that are between 0 and 7,500 people are in the top row, and all the counties, like LA County, that's between 100,000 people and the largest county are at the bottom. And you can see that it's not exactly an equal number of groups, but it's close enough to an equal number of groups, equal number of counties per group. And you can see that the median difference total population, that the smallest counties tended to gain people. They went up by 55 or 51 people. And the largest counties tended to lose people. They lost 136 people on average. So that was something that concerned us as well. And we saw that not only in total population, but also characteristics data. And this was sort of, we understood this to be a result of the post-processing that was going on that's been mentioned before. Okay, next slide, please. As a result of this bias, as smaller areas saw their population grow, the DAS algorithm had to put them somewhere. So they put them either in an already occupied housing unit, which increased household size. They put them in a GQ, or they put them in a vacant unit, which decreased the vacancy rate. And we can see that effect of this on the vacancy rates for these small areas. For the counties with the most units, the top quintile, their vacancy rates went up slightly, while those with the fewest units, the bottom quintile, saw their vacancy rates go down substantially. So that's a fairly noticeable result. And again, when I say go up or go down, it's purely as a result of the application of differential privacy and post-processing. It's purely as a result of the DAS, the DAS. It's not an over time comparison. Okay, next slide, please. So we realized from all of this discussion that we got a lot of feedback at the workshop. We got a lot of feedback in our email inbox as well. And we learned that the disclosure avoidance science team would be making improvements to the disclosure avoidance system. And we wanted a way that we could accurately quantify the improvements that they would make in those future runs. And so we developed data metrics based on feedback from our data users and stakeholders that covered accuracy, measures of bias, and counts of large outliers for basic demographic tabulations that we sort of thought of, and then as well as specific use cases. And we also broke it up by size in order to capture those differing effects for small counties, for example, versus large counties, or small places versus large places. So I've got here a snippet of table 1, and you can see that you've got a metric for all counties, all 3,143 counties in the U.S. with the mean absolute error of 82. So that suggests that for all counties, the mean county saw a difference of 82 people, plus or minus. We also have the MAPE, which is a percent on the side, which is the mean absolute percent error. This is the mean absolute percent error, not the median, which is why it's different from the slide that you saw before. But all of this was released on the website back in March, and we got a lot of great feedback on those metrics. So metrics measured the demonstration product compared to the 2010 tabulations. Okay, next slide, please. So in May 2020, the science team developed a new, in a sprint that concluded in May 2020, the science team developed a new method of doing the post-processing. And this post-processing was designed to improve accuracy at all levels and for all statistics. Essentially what it does is it performs multiple passes instead of a single pass. When it's they take the private statistics, so all tabulated values, number of 15-year-old males in this county, number of, et cetera, all of the various tabulated values that you need. They add noise to those tabulated values, and then they post-process those noisy statistics into a non-negative, logical, consistent microdata format. And that's where a lot of the noise was entering, as was mentioned in previous presentations. That post-processing introduced a lot of noise. And what they tried to do was they tried to do it all in a single pass. They did a one-shot optimization to say, let's make it as the least noisy microdata format that we can that also satisfies all of these conditions, such as having non-negative numbers. And what they found was instead doing multiple passes led to much better accuracy. So now they will do the total population first, and they'll do the tabulations necessary for the redistricting file next, holding the total population to what they had optimized before, and then the remaining tabulations. So that multiple pass ended up improving statistics, and we were able to see that by the data metrics. So in May, we released a new set of data metrics calculated from this version 2 of the 2020 DAS, and we can see substantial improvement. So next slide, please. So here's a couple of excerpts from the metrics. We can see here, this is table 1 that we saw before, counties by size. And we can see the metrics from the 2010 demonstration product. And then on the right, the metrics from the new DAS run, what we're calling vintage 2020-0527_P, which basically means May 27th, the person file. So you can see that, as I mentioned before, the mean absolute error for all counties was 82. So on average, counties gained or lost about 82 people. And with the new version of the DAS, with the same epsilon, with the same sort of noise infused, the metrics now show that counties are plus or minus about 16 people. So that's much better. We see some similar improvements for all county size levels as well, which is nice. So we see that, even the small counties with total population of less than 1,000, their mean absolute error goes from 76 down to 13.5. So that's a much more palatable bit of accuracy there. Next slide, please. We also see improvements even for those places and those geographies that are not on the spine. This version 2 of the DAS has not incorporated any new geographic hierarchy. As Joe mentioned, there's been discussion of modifying the geographic hierarchy to include, AIAN areas, as well as, legal entities like incorporated places or MCDs, where there are strong MCDs. There has been discussion of that, but it has not yet been implemented. But we are still seeing improvements for those off-spine locations in the new run. So that's very heartening to see. So we can see, for all incorporated places, it went from 85, plus or minus 85, using the demonstration product released in October, to now 54, or about 55, from the new DAS run. We do still see, that there is, higher error for larger places, which is, not what we're hoping. But, development is ongoing for those so-called off-spine geographies. So those
Matt,
metrics,
if you could wrap up in about 90 seconds so we could get a question in.
Absolutely. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry. So all of those metrics are now available on the website. In addition, we have released the public privacy-protected microdata file, which is the actual synthetic person-level data set to the public. And also, the Committee on National Statistics and IPMS, will be producing new demonstration data files, which will be tabulated values. So instead of dealing with the 14 gigabyte person level file, you'll be able to deal with the individually tabulated numbers. So that'll be much nicer. Next slide. This will be my final slide. In addition, we are improving the metrics. I encourage everyone to take a look at the currently available metrics, but we're planning to release by the end of this month new metrics, which will have new tables on new levels, such as school districts, Puerto Rico municipios, as well as some revised tables that will make it a lot easier, a lot more user-friendly to go through the metrics and see whether there's been an improvement in accuracy or whether there's still work to be done. So thank you very much, and I'll conclude there to allow some time for questions.
So we had some overage in the presentation times, so we don't have a whole lot of time left in the call for questions, but if anyone in the meeting has something and wants to raise their hand by way of shouting into the chat feature. We had a couple of sidebar discussions come up.
This is Nicholas. There was a question in the chat about population estimates program and whether that would use differentially private data. And this is a question for Census, but my understanding is that, yes, population estimates will be launched using the differentially private 2020 data, but that part of the privacy allocation is actually designed to try to create a better population estimates program than if they didn't allocate privacy there. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. We are engaged in research on the impacts of differential privacy and the best method of bringing our estimates production process into compliance with these new requirements. Vintage 2021, which will be released on a rolling basis beginning in December 2021, will be the first to have differential privacy applied to it. Our plan is to present to our internal data stewardship executive panel this fall, where we'll talk through how this is going to go. Essentially, we will be, able to eventually the plan is to make the estimates based on the differentially private data from the 2020 census. However, since it's such an ongoing, rapidly evolving situation, the initial estimates may not be purely based on the privacy protected microdata. They may be bringing in additional sources to sort of augment that. So I don't have any real details on that. That's not really my area about population estimates, but I can tell you that we are absolutely devoting a lot of time in research on how this is impacting estimates and to ensure that our estimates are of the highest quality.
Thank you.
As far as ACS goes, the earliest that ACS would have differential privacy applied to it is 2025. That is, the chief scientist has come out and said 2025 is the earliest that ACS data would have differential privacy involved. It's a little bit of a different animal because it is a survey, and it's a much more extensive survey versus the decennial, which is, as you know, an enumeration, a count of everyone. So the disclosure avoidance techniques may be somewhat different, or will be somewhat different for ACS. But at the very least, the director and the chief scientists have said that no differential privacy on the ACS until at least 2025 or later.
And with that, we've hit the end point in time of Paul or Bosla can chime in and see if they want to let Con have the last question or not have the last question.
This is Bosla. It's fine with me if somebody else wants to ask a question.
You're muted, Connie.
There we go. Okay. I asked about time series consistency, which is really, I think, important. It's going to be a problem for small governments with 2020 DP data compared to what was released to 2010, depending on where they fall in the draw of the distribution for differential privacy. And for the POP estimates, which are released every year, I think time series consistency will be really important. And so I asked about that, and I got a reply from Matt that said that he'd have to follow up and see. But I do think this is an aspect that we haven't focused on because this is the first attempt to use differential privacy for other than some specialized products at the Census Bureau, and products which are regularly produced, surveys that are regularly done, POP estimates that are regularly done. So I think this is actually an important issue that has to be addressed if differential privacy is to be, actually workable, as opposed to things bumping around, estimates bumping around over time. Thank you.
And I think that's where we're going to have to leave it. So thanks to everyone for listening on this brief reprise of a workshop, and look at the website for the archived presentations and video clips, and continue to follow the Census Bureau's page on disclosure avoidance for what they're doing, and the informal feedback that our expert groups are providing along the way. And thanks to all our presenters today.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.